Welcome to Liberty Starship, where we go beyond the typical terrestrial talk. I'm Eric Alexander, along with Peter Maines. Together, we are your crew and invite you to join us on the journey to discuss politics and current events. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't begin by acknowledging Memorial Day today. Today is Memorial Day, and due to the global pandemic, a lot of people are not celebrating it in the way they normally might be. But it's always important to remember what Memorial Day is all about, which is our fallen servicemen and women who perished in the various wars that have been fought, whether you agree with those wars or not. That is the point of the holiday. And I just wanted to acknowledge that there are many living veterans that will succumb to injuries they sustained in combat. And that's also important to remember as well, as we remember those veterans that have passed and the ones that are going to pass, again, because of wounds they sustained in combat. Some of them mental, some of them physical, some of them a combination of the two. So I just want to point that out there because a lot of people don't mention that when they talk about Memorial Day, that many of our living veterans will eventually succumb to their injuries, unfortunately, be it from a physical problem, things like Agent Orange. We can talk about those kinds of things. Or the mental issues that they might have when they take their own lives. So I just wanted to acknowledge that because in some ways it is a somber day, more so perhaps this Memorial Day weekend because of all the COVID restrictions that many states still have. In Arizona, we are lucky enough that we are pretty much open and you can pretty much celebrate Memorial Day any way you wish in the state of Arizona. But that is not the case in many other states and certainly not the case many other places in the world. Where they might so choose to acknowledge the day as well, being our allies and such. So I just wanted to get that out of the way and kind of go to a little bit more of a lighter place with our daily distractions. Now, I want to acknowledge the fact here that when we do daily distractions, I'm not always trying to say that the entire content of this article is terrible or that it's false or that's not really the point. The point is to talk about spin in the media and the fact that sometimes they're kind of, saying, look over here, look at the right hand and don't pay attention to what the left hand is doing. And don't acknowledge the fact that there is an agenda behind these articles. And so the first one I have is very visual in nature. And this is straight off of the CNN main page, specifically from CNN World. And this is the headline: Our New Normal in Pictures. And the very first picture that they have is this woman seated at a very posh restaurant with a bunch of mannequins. And you can see here, it says Jessie Dawson, an executive assistant for The Inn at Little Washington, is joined by mannequins as she sits in the Arlington, Virginia restaurant on Wednesday, May 20th. The restaurant will be reopening later this month and kept at 50% capacity for social distancing purposes. It says dressed up mannequins will be seated among others. So the idea that this is the new normal is something that I take exception with. And that's why I think it's a distraction. We keep hearing that term constantly about the new normal. I do not believe this is the new normal, and I don't believe we should accept this as the new normal. I think we should accept this as these are extraordinary times. We are in the middle of a crisis which we hope is starting to wane, but this is not the new normal. And that's just, I don't believe that. I don't believe we should view this kind of situation as the new normal. It shouldn't be accepted as the new normal. Certainly not having dinner with a bunch of mannequins, because this is obviously an extreme image. And this is an extreme setup. This is not something that's common with dine-in restaurants all around the country or around the world where you're sitting here with mannequins. It makes for a good picture, though. Definitely makes for a good picture. What do you think about this idea of the new normal, Pete? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very well-dressed mannequin. I think he has a very good tailor. But you're right. It isn't the new normal. There are a lot of things that will be the new normal. Like I'm wearing a mask right now. In the future, say next year, during flu season, even if we don't have another, God forbid, we don't have another outbreak of COVID, even if that's all done and all we have is the flu, I think you will see people wearing masks in public. when it's flu season. That could be the new normal, or fewer people shaking hands, or people using Purell a lot more. These are things that could be the new normal. Having tea parties with mannequins, I don't think is the new normal.
And I would go so far as to say the idea of wearing masks during flu season would not be a bad thing for the new normal. Now, if the government decides, whichever level of government decides that they're going to force you to wear the mask, that's, I think, where a lot of people have a problem. You know what I mean? If you choose to wear a mask, and also I want to put out there that if a business chooses to require you to wear a mask, that's up to that business. The issue, I think, when it comes from a liberty standpoint, has to do with when the state decides that you have to wear a mask, and that's where things get a little iffy, and that's where a lot of us have, a lot of different opinions when it comes to how to implement that, how to deal with that. And of course, many states that initially were saying you had to wear masks, they immediately rescinded the order because they weren't getting compliance. And that's an example of how civil disobedience works, is that if enough people break the law, that law becomes unenforceable, and you can't do it anymore.
And let's talk about masks. There's a lot of fear over masks right now. It's one of the reasons why I chose to wear a mask tonight, was because I've seen so many people that you and I both know, they're mutual friends. Let's say Michael Ward. He's the husband of Kelly Ward, the chairwoman of the Arizona Republican Party. He was wearing a mask on an airplane, which that's fine. And I understand that he doesn't maybe wear a mask frequently, but you have to on the airplane. Why? Well, because airplanes are a common place that people can transmit diseases. I don't know how many, under normal circumstances, in normal times, I've gotten sick on the airplane. We all have. And so to say that people should take extra precautions in a place where you know that disease transmission is already very common is just common sense, and it's not tyranny. You have people who are running for office in Arizona who are saying, I won't fly on airplanes anymore because I have to wear a mask to the airport, and I find that unacceptable. And honestly, if that is the price of your patriotism, that wearing a mask is too big a sacrifice to protect your fellow citizens, maybe you need to be real with yourself about how patriotic you are. I don't know if you...
Well, I think part of the discussion with that, because we were ahead of the curve on this particular issue, and we can't forget the fact that we were blatantly lied to by our quote scientific community, by our quote unquote medical community. They blatantly lied to us in the West and told us that masks were not effective, that we shouldn't be wearing them, strictly because there was a shortage of masks and they wanted them for themselves. I can't say it any more plain than that. And that has led to an intense amount of confusion from people because they remember those days. In fact, someone, I'm not going to call her out, but someone that I admire quite a bit in the Liberty movement posted a post of Dr. Fauci talking about how masks were not effective. Of course, this was before the narrative changed, right? And that's the problem. That's absolutely part of the problem. And I think it's also part of why a lot of people have become hostile towards masks, especially on the Liberty side.
Yeah, I think it's a subconscious thing. I think it's people are afraid, like my identity is being erased. And that's just not true. That's the wrong way to think about it. I mean, think about it as a tool. Think about it as a way to protect people around you. And the fact that the president will not wear a mask when he gives, you've mentioned these governors. I mean, not Mario Cuomo, that's his dad, but Andrew Cuomo has been vociferous in saying everybody needs to wear masks, and yet he never wears a mask in public. You never see de Blasio wear a mask in public. None of these politicians do, because their brand is more important to them than than the safety of the people around them. And Washington, D.C. has been hit very, very hard by COVID. It's one of the biggest hotspots in the country because you have politicians flying in and flying out from all over the country. And so if any place is going to get it, Washington, D.C., it just makes sense that they would get it. But the only politician I've seen wearing a mask is Martha McSally. And I don't know if you've seen it. She's gotten absolutely hammered by her primary opponent because she wore a mask, as though This was an example of cowardice or failed leadership. And honestly, I really respect her for doing it, because she's one of the only politicians who's putting her money where her mouth is, who is leading by example instead
Well,
of
well,
feeding into the fear and doing the easy thing, which is what I
well,
see
this is
most politicians doing.
this is something I just put on before we went on the air. This was a post from the Secretary of Defense. Obviously, a Memorial Day celebration. Looks like at Arlington Cemetery. You can see Secretary of Defense standing next to the Vice President and the President, and you can see quite a few uniformed military that are also participating. And I just put it out there. Do you think they should have masks on? I didn't say whether they should or they shouldn't, but I asked the question: should they have masks on in this situation as they are? Now you can see there is some spacing between them. Is it 6 feet? I doubt it. No, it doesn't look like 6 feet to me. And of course, a lot of people think the 6 feet thing is arbitrary, and they could be correct in that assessment. But I did put out the question: should they be wearing masks?
Well, yeah, of course it's arbitrary, because there's no magic line of exactly where it's safe or where it's not safe to wear a mask. Obviously, if there are diminishing returns. Maybe 6 feet is the optimal point. Probably it's just a convenient way, because it's easy to imagine 6 feet. It's 2 meters. It's the height of a man. It's 2 yards in football, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely.
But if you don't have a number out there that people are like the hand washing song, 25 seconds. Well, what if you do 26? What if you do 24? That's not the point. The point is to be conscientious about it.
What if you do 16?
What if you do 16? That might be just as good. I mean, I don't know. But give people a target. It's kind of like the mask. We were lied to about the masks because they're hoping to get a certain effect. And it's a more benign example, but I think the 6 feet rule is kind of in that category, but at least it's honest. They haven't said exactly why. They're not lying to anybody. They're just giving a rule for everybody to follow. And can I, before we get off the masks thing, I threw up something on the screen, and this is something that really hits home to me. I've talked about the Catholic right, and as a Catholic and somebody who is on the right, this really offends me. If you don't know Rusty Reno, I just bought his book, and I read his book this week, which is called The Return of the Strong Gods, I think, or maybe just The Strong Gods. And earlier, well, see, this is from the 18th. And so you can see he's apologizing for a tweet that he made on Tuesday, May 12th. So that's now about 2 weeks ago. But this has been sort of a rolling story. And when he said, "You're a coward if you wear a mask. Our veterans in World War II didn't wear masks," which is obviously ridiculous. It's a lie. Soldiers wear gas masks all the time for obvious reasons. It's a tool. It's not because they're cowards, or maybe they're trying to hide their identity or whatever. There are reasons why somebody who is not a coward would wear a mask. So he put that out there, and he got absolutely hammered on Twitter. So badly, in fact, that he later deleted his Twitter account. But at the time that he made it, you had people like Austin Ruse of Crisis Magazine, another conservative Catholic magazine, and these are well-known publications, okay? Maybe not familiar to our audience, but in my world, this is really big. These are people I know read these magazines, and I find what Reno is doing to be absolutely shameful. The way they've politicized wearing masks, the way they've politicized their faith, and I believe there's an intersection between faith and politics, and I've written dozens of articles on that specific topic, on the intersection of faith and politics. But they are turning politics, in my opinion, into an idol if they think that this advances their mission as a religious organization to discourage people from wearing masks. Absolutely, in my opinion, disgusting. And he did apologize, but you can see it's like maybe half a paragraph, really. It's almost an incomplete thought. It says, "It was wrong for me to impugn the intentions and motives of others, for which I apologize." And that's it. He didn't explain, his thought process or how he got there. It's just sort of, "Gee, I'm sorry," just kind of kicking the dirt and making the the minimum apology possible. But I think people who are very against masks need to do some real soul searching
Well, again,
about what it means. Yeah.
I just want to emphasize the other side of this that I don't think is quite frankly getting any coverage at all, which is again the fact that we were lied to. And I'm not going to give up on that narrative because I was
Right.
ahead on this issue and I brought it up. It was one of our main segments. I broke it down. I showed scientific studies that show that masks are effective. And this was at a time when officially the quote unquote medical community and scientific community said masks were not effective. Don't wear a mask. They said do not wear a mask.
Mhm.
And I think, again, that is causing a lot of the anger and confusion because people feel like they cannot trust these medical authorities anymore. And in a very real way, you can't. You can't. That's the unfortunate thing. But also keep in mind here, we're talking about a novel virus, one that we are learning more and more about every day. And there are things that they're finding out. For instance, I saw an article recently, and I talked about this on the air, speculation, which, by the way, folks, the way scientific advancement happens is through speculation. You make a hypothesis based on observation or based on things you've seen, things you've read. And I told you that there was a possibility they were going to say that this surface transmission is not the major way that corona is being transmitted. And sure enough, there are scientists starting to say, yep, we really overestimated surface transmission. Now, again, it's a novel virus. The jury's still out, okay? I'm just saying that's already starting to happen. And again, we're going to be finding out we were lied to. In other words, the hand washing isn't as important as the mask. And that's the problem. That's the problem is people were lied to because certain people decided to speak with authority when they had no authority because they didn't know what they were talking about. That's how a novel virus works. There is no expert on COVID-19 because it hasn't been around long enough for anyone to become an expert. Therefore, they are speculating based on things like influenza, things that work kind of in the same way. But that's the problem. And so then they try to speak with authority and tell you what to do, and it turns out they're wrong. And that's the problem. And then it erodes confidence in the entire system. But I did want to mention this since we were talking. I think it's a good segue because you were talking about.
Before we move off, I think that's a very good point you just made there. And so one thing I'd like to say is, yes, they were lying to us, and they were doing so out of selfishness, that they were worried that they would not have enough masks. If you remember the outrage over Richard Burr and other senators profiting off of the COVID crash, how much more? Yeah, okay, they made some money, and other people lost money, and sometimes people might commit suicide because they had they were financially ruined or whatever. But this mask scandal, to me, is even bigger. And if you are a conspiracy theorist, if you're worried about the essence of any conspiracy theory is you are worried about corruption, about people who are elite, who have power, misusing that power, self-dealing, taking care of themselves, and hurting the little guy, right? That's the basic template of any conspiracy theory. This mask thing is exactly that. People in power worried that they were going to not have access to what they wanted or needed, and they were willing to hurt everybody else just out of pure. Well, I think they thought it was for the greater good, but ultimately it was a very selfish action to lie to people and to treat us this way.
No, I don't know if I even believe that, to be honest with you. So I think it was a very selfish thing that they did. And it obviously, I think we were trying to get at is it cost people lives. It costs lives. There's just no doubt about it to me that it costs lives. And I can't really say much more about that without starting to get emotional and losing my reason, which is not what I'm about. I think that's the problem with the other side is they get too irrational. We all get upset. We all get upset. We're all human beings. But that kind of stuff, it does really upset me. Now, we were talking about churches earlier. You brought that up. So yes. I wanted to mention this, okay? Because this was something that was making big news. And it says, this is from a Fox News article. And it says, California announces churches, houses of worship can reopen under certain guidelines amid coronavirus outbreak. Now, of course, this is a result of Trump's threat against the states, saying that if you do not open churches, I will. And a lot of people, especially a lot of people actually on the Liberty side, were upset by that comment that Trump made, because there's this idea that I don't understand, that it's okay for you to be oppressed as long as it's your state that oppresses you and not the federal government. That's the problem that I really have with a lot of the quote unquote liberty side of this argument. Also, it's a never Trumper thing. Anything Trump says is wrong. Anything Trump says is wrong. So it's a never Trumper thing. And I'm kind of sick of it. As you know, anybody who views this, they know I am an advocate of the 14th Amendment. I am also an advocate of the 10th Amendment. I'm an advocate of both, but I am an advocate ultimately of those being used, both of those amendments being used to protect your freedoms. That is the entire intention of the 10th Amendment. That's the entire intention of the 14th Amendment. Is there is a balancing act where sometimes, yes, the federal government is the oppressor, but there are also times that your local government is the oppressor. Jim Crow, obviously, is a great example of this. This is one of the biggest reasons that we have the Civil Rights Act, whether you agree with all of it or not. But it was done to enact, the 14th Amendment, because we had these egregious violations where states were violating people's rights. And the same thing has been happening all over the country, where governors have sidestepped the Constitution and they have closed down churches of worship under pain of arrest. And by the way, pain of arrest can mean pain of death. Okay, that's the truth of it. Anytime you make a law and you decide that you can arrest somebody for it, or even fine somebody for it, that means that you are allowing someone, usually a police officer, to stop this person forcibly and either issue the citation or arrest them. And when that person says no, bad things happen. I know this because I have 20 years of experience doing this. So it really upsets me when we get this sort of idea that it's okay for your local government to oppress you. I just don't understand it. And it's all in the name of, well, we don't want Trump involved because we don't like Trump. I think this is great that that the president did say that he would step in. I think it's great, actually, that the governor of California, Newsom, has decided to at least put some compliance into this and put out some rules so that churches can open. But I also want to point out, in Arizona, we never closed the churches. They closed on their own. Governor Ducey's order did not include churches, and it never should have, because that is unconstitutional. There is nothing in the Constitution that I can see that says you are allowed to suspend the Bill of Rights under any circumstances absent martial law. And the way martial law works in a legal sense is you suspend habeas corpus. And when that happens, of course, the whole thing is basically trashed. So we haven't had that, thankfully, because, again, President Trump didn't allow it, even though he was called to put military in the streets and do all those kinds of things. He didn't do it. So, again, I'll leave it at this. And Pete, you can say I want you to chime in as well. But my thought is,
I will.
just remember, a broken clock is always right at least twice a day. So be careful with not you specifically, but I think in liberty in general, people have to be careful with the never Trump and Trump is always wrong and all that kind of stuff, because he has been very right when it comes to not implementing martial law, not suspending habeas corpus, not putting the military on the street, and also in this case for advocating for churches to be able to open up, because that's what the Constitution says. And the Constitution overrides every single one of these state governors.
Yeah, you've had a lot of these governors have way overstepped their bounds. I would say a little bit of nuance here. If, again, the classic example is if the Japanese, like during World War II, were off of our Pacific coast, and you have a right to have lights on and have people over to your house and congregate and whatever. But during the blackouts, you had to turn off your lights. And that's, in emergency circumstances, I can understand orders like that. But this was done very haphazardly. There's no due process. There's no statute of limitations. Look, if they can do this just arbitrarily, one person, they don't have to get a warrant, there's no process to say what are the limits, what's the time frame, then this is just tyranny, because they could do it for 6 months, or they could do it for a year. And if they could do it for COVID, they could do it for the flu. If there is, when you are endangering your neighbors, as in the case of the Japanese off the coast, then there's a case for more restrictions, because those are your rights. My right to swing my arms around ends at the tip of your nose. But here, there's no demonstrated danger from going to church. It's, yeah, you could spread the virus, but where does it stop? I mean, you've mentioned before that reporters have asked, are you going to shut down grocery stores? Well, you can't do that, right? So at the end of the day, it's a cost-benefit analysis.
And I do want to put some context into this, because part of the reason that basically the Justice Department stepped in and told California that their policy was discriminatory was because they were allowing retail stores to open up, but they were not allowing churches to open up. And that was clearly discrimination,
Yeah, and yes, it's discrimination. It's arbitrary. They're making rules without really thinking. So if you can open up a retail store, which isn't essential, well, that means that you can open up that church, but you're choosing not to. And so,
and again, I would advocate that churches are essential, because churches are protected under the Bill of Rights. Why didn't we shut down the free press, Pete? Why didn't we shut the free press down? Because the First Amendment says you can't. Because it says you can't. That's a very good point.
Yeah. Churches are given a special level of protection because of the way that this could be used to, for example, shut down religious minorities. We heard Bill de Blasio make those very weird comments about the Hasidic community, that they were going to padlock the synagogues and never allow them to open again. Well, there we know. I mean, that's a blinking red light. Obviously, that is way over the line. And if he were to do that, that would be a blatant constitutional violation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just glad that that the Justice Department did step in, and that the state is actually issuing some guidelines. I don't necessarily agree with the guidelines. I'm not going to go over them here, but at least they're doing something. At least it's liberty moving in the right direction, and that's one thing that I'm always about, because I always think the other side uses incrementalism all the time. Our side needs to use incrementalism as well, and has to realize that sometimes you can't push back all the way. You push back a little bit, and you keep pushing, and eventually you get to where you want to be.
And I would say we've given our governors and our mayors a lot of leeway up to this point, because our thinking was, okay, this is an emergency. We're going to take some time, figure out how deadly this virus is, how it's spread, those sorts of important questions that would actually tell us, what is the scope of this emergency? What are the necessary precautions? What is dangerous, and what can we do without endangering other people?
Well, the entire definition of an emergency is that it's temporary. So it's like these orders that these governors are using, these are meant to deal with things like forest fires or a hurricane or a tornado or something like that, where immediate action is needed, and you can't just call the legislature together and decide, hey, we're going to evacuate this town. The governor has to have that authority to do that. That's what these come from. When it comes to a pandemic, you've had all this time to evaluate the situation and to mitigate. And you've brought this up. There's been all this time for legislatures to come in, and if they want to pass all sorts of crazy laws, they can, but they're not doing that. Instead, what they're doing is just giving up all of their authority to the local governor or the mayor and letting them decide everything. And that's the problem that I have, is we're way beyond that point. At this point, the legislature should be stepping in. We could have a new health regulation, for instance, that says workers have to wear masks. The legislature has had plenty of time to do that in all 50 states. They could decide that and say, okay, we're going to make workers wear masks. They could do that. They could pass a law and say that. Instead, we have this, these executive orders that are deciding that. And we're way beyond that time period. This is not democracy. This is not a constitutional republic when one man or one woman is deciding these things. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. It's not how it's supposed to work.
Yeah. Not only is it illegal, unconstitutional, but this is gross incompetence that we're now several months into this crisis, and we have no real idea what the IFR, the infected fatality rate, is. How could we not know that? How could that not be the most important thing to figure out as soon as possible? But we have absolutely no idea. Or if we do, that
Well,
number has not
there
been
is
released to the public.
there are
There are
some
estimates out there.
Yeah, but I just want to point out that as far as that kind of thing goes, there are places you can look at that have done a much better job with testing, and you can get that number pretty close. And I'm talking about like South Korea. I've put up South Korea as a model of a country where they did implement widespread testing. They also do a lot of contact tracing, which of course is not popular among liberty advocates. They don't like the apps. They don't like that kind of stuff. But you know what? It's been very successful there. And so you have an example in South Korea of interventions that can be made where they didn't suspend liberty. They really didn't. You know, you gave up a little bit of your freedom when it comes to the contact tracing. And instead, you were still able to go worship. You were still able to go. They even had nightclubs open. I mean, they still had an intense amount of freedom that we were denied here in the United States. And then in contrast, you have the other side of the coin where Sweden, where they did essentially nothing. And you can look at those numbers as well. So I advocate people to do that. And you can kind of see how it works. The do nothing model, and you can also see the do something model without destroying all your freedoms. But they did have to give up some things. You know, they were using the apps and things like that. Although I think most of that was voluntary. Just a different culture where they were willing to do that. Japan's another interesting example of where they really didn't do a whole lot, and you can see the numbers are very different. So again, this situation is evolving, but if you want to find that information, we're getting indications now of how that looks. The German numbers are interesting too, because Germany also managed this crisis in an interesting way, different than a lot of other countries did, in terms of, yes, they had much better testing than many other countries did. And that's part of this equation that we often forget. The testing's getting there, and testing's become much more available. But without widespread testing, you still don't really know exactly what your problem, how the extent of your problem. That's the ultimate gauge of how big this thing really is.
Yeah. And Sweden is a more complicated case than we think it is, because while they didn't have a stay-at-home order, people have been taking precautions. People aren't stupid. And especially the Swedes, they're a very cohesive culture. It's a small country. It's kind of like living in a small town where you know everybody. Even their biggest cities are not very large compared to, say, New York City or LA. We don't always appreciate that here as Americans, that a large city in Europe isn't necessarily like a large city here in the US. So it's a very different thing. Even though they've had a higher rate of incidents than say Denmark or Norway, their curve kind of looks like the US. Things are going in the right direction. They've peaked, and the number of fatalities, thankfully, is going down. But it's not as simple as Sweden did absolutely nothing and it worked out for them. No,
that's all. But also, there's another side to that, Pete, which is unlike what you're seeing with people here, and we were just talking about the mask issue. A lot of that, I think, is quarantine fatigue, and quarantine fatigue doesn't exist in Sweden because they were still allowed to do things. They were still allowed to go to school. They were still allowed to go to the bar throughout this entire crisis. And therefore, there is no quarantine fatigue in Sweden because the only people quarantined in Sweden are people that are supposed to be quarantined, people that were sick. You don't quarantine healthy people. That's shelter in place, right? There was no shelter in place in Sweden. There were quarantines, but of sick people. That's a big difference too. So you don't have this quote unquote quarantine fatigue effect that we have in the United States.
Right. So that tells you that maybe these shelter-in-place orders aren't necessary and aren't effective, whereas quarantining sick people we know is effective. All of the data from this pandemic and previous pandemics shows that it is and can be effective.
And I do want to put that out there, that because even I do it too, is there is a difference between a quarantine and shelter-in-place. And what we did was shelter-in-place. Everybody's been doing quarantines because everybody has been quarantining sick people pretty much across the board, universally in almost every country. But we have countries like Sweden that did not do the shelter in place.
So, speaking of precautions, there's one precaution that we're starting to see a little more, which is that businesses are saying they don't want to take cash. And you said that you went to GameStop, and they would not take your cash. And there was a store, and I don't remember, so I'm not going to even mention who it was that wouldn't take my cash this week. I was really surprised that I had to use my card. The San Francisco police chief is saying that these businesses are breaking the law. And I think that's a really interesting legal argument. I don't know. I haven't seen a court case where this has actually been adjudicated. What I have read from economists, from people who are experts on money, is that that is incorrect legally, or at least in terms of the purpose of tender laws, of public tender laws for all debts, public and private, is essentially that money is viewed by the government as tax tokens. And so and he's saying this is a matter of equity, because if you are poor, you may only have cash, or you may only have access to cash. You may not have a bank account. In the United States, it's very easy for a lot of people to get locked out of the banking system. We don't think about it because most people, let's say it's 98% of people have access to a bank account. 2% can still be an awful lot. And so I think this guy has the right idea, and I hope he succeeds in his lawsuit. And I say his lawsuit, I mean, he's the one enforcing the law. So he doesn't have to necessarily take it to court. He can go to businesses and force them, if they still don't want to take cash, force them to take him to court, because
I do want to mention, because I have the article in front of me as well, and he is citing a specific city ordinance that requires them to take cash. It looks like it was actually meant to help food trucks. And yes, apparently there is an ordinance in San Francisco that says yes, you have to take cash. So it goes beyond even sort of the broader constitutional argument. He's actually citing a specific ordinance that they have in San Francisco that says you have to accept cash.
But this is something, and I to take this from a liberty perspective, because that, of course, is our main focus, is the liberty movement, issues that affect liberty. This war on cash, now I'm thankfully, in this case, it's kind of the opposite. It's not government, it's private businesses. But this war on cash is something that's been going on for a long time. And a lot of times what happens in crises, is that actors who had plans, who had policies they want to push, will push those ideas. It's called political entrepreneurialism, where they have something they want. So like the Patriot Act included a lot of things that John Ashcroft wanted to pass before 9/11, but he was unable to pass because at the time there was no political appetite for it. Well, this COVID crisis could be the time when a lot, if not San Francisco, other places in the country start banning cash. And why? You may have heard the $100 bill called the Bin Laden. Have you heard that, Eric?
That sounds familiar. It actually does sound familiar.
Yeah, well, the Washington Post, I shared with you earlier a Washington Post article from 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, where they were arguing for banning the $100 bill because having $100 bills facilitates the drug trade. Well, that's absolutely insane. You could pay for anything in cash, literally anything. It says all debts, public and private. And we all know that cash is king. Cash will buy anything you want to buy. But there are people who want to track your transactions, who don't believe that you have a right to privacy, who don't believe, and these are people in government, there's people at the Washington Post. In this case, well, the business owners aren't saying that it's about your privacy, but it affects your privacy. And so in essence, these store owners are saying, we, at least, even if we're not openly hostile to your privacy, we don't care about it enough to protect it, which is what allowing people to pay in cash largely does.
I also want to mention, I want to mention something specific here, because so much of these kinds of things, it's like, I think you're absolutely correct. I think that this is part of a larger issue, but I want to explain the fact that part of the justification for this is the idea that surface transmission is a substantial cause of coronavirus transmission. That's what they're trying to say, right? Even in this article, I'm quoting directly from the article that you just had up. It said, according to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, transmission of COVID-19 is thought to spread mainly from person to person, either between people who are in close contact with one another within about 6 feet, or through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs or sneezes. Quote, it may be possible that a person can get COVID-19 by touching a surface or object that has the virus on it and then touching their own mouth, nose, or possibly their eyes. But, quote, this is not thought to be the main way the virus spreads. And we were talking about that earlier, Peter. So it is part of a larger agenda. It has nothing to do with the virus. It has nothing to do with the virus.
Yeah, and it gets back to this thing that we're often lied to, that people are telling us that you need to use Purell, even though they don't have that information. They don't really know, for example, can it be, nobody's an expert on this. They don't know ahead of time, can it be transmitted? But now we do know that it cannot. It cannot be transmitted easily, at least, by surface contact. And yet they're still pushing the same agenda. This is political entrepreneurialism. People exploiting the crisis in order to push ideas and policies that they wanted to push anyway.
Hey, never let a crisis, never let a good crisis go to waste, Pete. We know the playbook. We know the playbook of those that advocate for tyranny. It's always been the same. It always will be the same. Never let a crisis go to waste.
But we can do that on the Liberty side too. And that's why I wanted to share a little bit about privacy coins. I don't know if you've heard about privacy coins. They're a type of cryptocurrency. And there's a new one called Ghost that's being promoted by McAfee, who is running for the vice presidency on the Libertarian ticket. I don't know if he's still in the running. I don't think he is now that I don't see Jo Jorgensen signing up to run on a ticket with McAfee, or McAfee. But this is really interesting because this is about a 10-page white paper, and it's not very technical, but it goes over the main features of what the Ghost privacy coin is. Now, everybody knows what Bitcoin is. It's a crypto coin. It's basically you own numbers, kind of, that are difficult to calculate, and there's a whole network. There's a concept called proof of work. So if you do a certain amount of computations, you earn coins from the network. And ultimately, there's a certain number of coins that could be 1 million, it could be 20 million. It depends on which cryptocurrency you're talking about. Well, this Ghost company is a little bit different. They have some features that as I read through the white paper, I thought were really interesting. I mean, first of all, is that it's freaking fast. So you may know, if you've ever done a Bitcoin transaction, it could take a minute or 30 minutes or an hour or a couple hours. It just depends on the speed of the network at that time, or maybe there's a lot of transactions going on. Whereas McAfee's Ghost coin transactions are supposed to happen in 60 seconds. And that's because they're using technology from Dash and other speed-oriented cryptocurrencies. So they're using the best technology. The thing about Bitcoin is it was the first one. So you shouldn't expect that the first one of anything, just like, the first operating system for a computer, or the first word processor. We used to use WordPerfect in the old days, and we don't use that anymore. Why not? Because somebody invented something better, and this is something better. It's faster. It's more decentralized.
Well, so we don't use salt or seashells as currency anymore either, right?
Not very often. But so there's a couple of other things, and I don't want to get too dorky, but one thing is it's really decentralized. So if you buy Bitcoin, you can go on to bitcoin.com or there's a bunch of them, Coinbase, CoinMama. There are different exchanges, CoinDex, and McAfee has his own exchange. There's about 4 exchanges that will handle this. But basically, you cannot hold these coins, as if I understand the white paper correctly, on an exchange. You have to have a lot that is on your computer. Now, before, the other privacy coin that's really popular right now. It's called Monero. And Monero, if you want to hold your wallet on your computer, it's like gigabytes of data, like, I don't know, 50 gigabytes of data. I tried to install a Monero wallet just to see how it worked a couple months ago. And as I saw my hard drive filling up, I said, oh no, this is going away. I am stopping this. And so I just deleted it. But this is something that can be done very practically. You can have it on your computer, and yet you still have the benefit that it's decentralized. And so it's not all, you don't have to have all these ledgers. So they found a smarter way to keep your transactions private. And I won't go through the individual tokens.
Pete, what do you think? And you don't have to get too deep into this, because obviously you're talking about this specific proposal and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of us who are more traditional, obviously a lot of us Liberty folks are into sound money. You can see a little picture of me with Ron Paul, and sound money was always something that I was very interested in, and always have been interested in. And the idea of, possibly a return to the gold standard and things like that. Mm-hmm. One of the things I know that Ron Paul himself has talked about on his show is that he hasn't dismissed Bitcoin, as far as I know, but I've heard him voice some concerns that Bitcoin is really just more fiat. It's just fiat in a different way, as opposed to having something real like a precious metal like gold or silver. Can you just comment about that? Your thoughts on that, just a little bit?
Yeah, I think Ron Paul is right on that. There's nothing backing Bitcoin, which is why when people have talked to me about cryptocurrencies, I've pointed them to, there are currencies where instead of just calculating random numbers, you're calculating something that can be used to benefit, for example, cancer research. And so maybe what you're buying is part of the trust. It's a real asset that is then so let's say they're researching a cure for cancer, and they're going to market that at some point in the future. And it's not all about the money. That's why they're crowdsourcing it. But you get to benefit a little bit because you've given up some of your electricity and processing power. That costs money to do Bitcoin mining. In fact, it can cost quite a bit of money, which is another benefit of Ghost, is that it uses less energy than other cryptocurrencies. But yeah, I think Ron Paul is right. I would prefer a cryptocurrency that was backed by something real. Ghost McAfee is not only a cryptocurrency that's backed by nothing, but it also has an elastic supply. And so the amount of Ghost coins, again, if I understand the white paper correctly, the amount of coins in circulation will vary to some degree depending on the amount of volume in order to keep the value steady. And so it's kind of like a central bank is manipulating the money supply in order to keep the dollar from crashing. But there's nothing fundamentally backing the dollar except perhaps the amount of demand from people paying their taxes, which is a difference between. But that said, if there's another reason why you absolutely need to use a cryptocurrency, let's say you live in Venezuela or other places where you can't trust local money, and so cryptocurrency is the only way to do transactions, maybe then it does have intrinsic value because this is a way you can trade tokens. Just like in colonial times, if you went down to the tailor, a lot of stuff was done on credit. And so the only money that existed, you didn't have a piece of gold with you, but you would get some credit at the tailor and he would mark, and you have to put more value into the economy within a month or something like that. But so you can have money systems that work and make sense that are based on almost kind of barter, and I could see how that could tie into this, But the question is, what is that need? Not only because if you're in Venezuela or somewhere else where you can't trust the money, let's say you're in Zimbabwe, you don't necessarily have to use Bitcoin or Ghost. You could use Ethereum, or you could use Dash, or you could use. There's so many different cryptocurrencies out there. Any specific one, its only value is on essentially the value it provides in allowing people to trade value to each other. I don't know how else to put it, but that's just my opinion.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so something like this, which is very fast, it doesn't have the drawbacks, it's lower energy and so on, maybe that has more value than Bitcoin because it allows you to do quick transactions, even though the token you're using to do those transactions doesn't have intrinsic value. Just the fact that it's so easy to pass around makes it valuable, perhaps. That's my theory.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, obviously, Bitcoin has been around for a little while now, and there's people that obviously have made quite a bit of money off of it. So
Right. And if
we'll
it were
see,
going to go
right?
to zero, you would think in the, what has it been now, 15 years that it's been, people have been talking about it and using it. I mean, you can buy all kinds of things with Bitcoin today. And so if it was going to go away, you'd think it would have gone away by now. And so I think there's something there, even if it's fiat, even if it's not the best currency, even if it's not as good as gold, to say it has no value or just a fiat currency, it's a bubble or whatever, I think those people have been pretty definitively disproven just by the fact that we can see it's been used effectively for so long.
Again, that's interesting. It's one of those topics, I'll be honest, I don't know a whole lot about because I don't engage in any cryptocurrency trading or anything like that. I have the same concerns I have with regular money, quite frankly, with fiat money of any kind when it's not backed by anything. I have concerns, and that's been the case with all of the various cryptocurrencies. But I think it's interesting. It's definitely, I definitely do wish I had been involved with Bitcoin at the beginning because there was definitely money to be made there. I mean, that's just undeniable.
Well,
That's just a fact. So
that's the thing about Ghost. Right now, Ghost is kind of at the ground floor. It just dropped today. And so if you want to get it on the ground floor of a cryptocurrency, one that probably has a future because it's backed by very smart people, has all the latest features, Ghost, I think, and this is not financial advice, and please don't come back and sue me, but I think this is a big opportunity.
it very well could be. It very well could be.
Yeah. Well, speaking of technology, you mentioned, it says there's no sound. Are we having trouble sound? You can hear me?
I can hear you. I'm not sure if we're having some issues as far as going out, but yes, we have a comment there from Hillbilly
Hillbilly. Yeah.
that we have no sound on the on the YouTube. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But if that continues to be the problem, please let us know so that we can try to see if we can correct it. I'm not sure what we can do at this point because I'm hearing you loud and clear. So I'm not sure what the issue might be. It might be just YouTube because we don't know about the other. We do a multi-stream here. We do one for not just YouTube. We do Facebook and we also do Twitter. And so if there's some sort of sound issue going on, it could be simply because of all the internet bandwidth that's being taken up right now.
Yes. So yeah, we can hear each other anyway. So as far as technology goes, given that possible potential technical glitch, what do you think about SpaceX? Is that you had something you want to share with us tonight about SpaceX and the privatization of space travel?
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. This is very historic and obviously ties into to our name. You know, the fact that this is called Liberty Starship, and we obviously have a little bit of a starship theme. We have a little space background going on right now as we're speaking. This is a BBC News article, and it says NASA SpaceX launch. Astronauts complete rehearsal for a historic mission. And this is hot off the presses type of stuff. You can see a picture of them there, of the astronauts. I actually want to get this much better picture where you can see the new spacesuits, which I think look very futuristic, very sleek, and a lot of people are commenting on that. But this is an interesting point for the history of space travel, and I think ultimately the history of humanity. This mission is going to be critical. We'll see how it goes because this hasn't happened yet. They're just getting ready. The launch is on Wednesday. And so in some ways it's exciting, but in other ways I'm apprehensive. We have had disasters in the history of our space program, and we're not alone in that. The Russians have had disasters as well. And you know, not too long ago, there was a failed launch that didn't make a whole lot of headlines. But I remember watching it live, and there was I think within the last year and a half, I want to say, there was a failed launch to the International Space Station by the Russians. So things can happen, things can go wrong. And in this particular situation, if something goes wrong, it's going to be amplified by a million. but I'm very hopeful that this is going to be a successful mission, and it's very exciting. You know, on the one hand, I have a little bit of a bias because I just think it was kind of nice that we had, you know, that NASA had its own space vehicles, that they had, you know, 4 shuttles and all that kind of stuff. And I love the shuttle. I think the shuttle was really cutting edge and really interesting, but it was immensely expensive to operate. And everything that I've been looking at says that this is going to be much, much cheaper. So that's obviously good for the taxpayer if we can get a little bit more bang for the buck. Literally, a little more boost for the buck in this scenario. But I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic. I hope it all goes well, and this will indeed bring in a new era of commercial space flight. Now, right now, this is still under the government tab, so keep that in mind that the government is paying for all this. But technically speaking, they don't own the rocket. They are basically leasing it from SpaceX, which is really interesting. Did you have any thoughts about that, Pete? You're mute.
Yeah,
mute.
Yes, I do. I was on mute.
Yeah, your mute was on.
Yeah, anything that we can do to bring down the price of space travel is awesome in my book. And we all know that the only thing that brings down prices in the long term is price signals. You have to have a market, you have to have competition, you have to have private actors competing. Otherwise, the price will always be what it always was. There's very little incentive to innovate at the government level. It's not even when in the glory days of the space race, we oftentimes think of that as being a purely public endeavor. People will often say, "We got to the moon. How come we can't cure cancer?" Or "How come we can't?" When we went to the moon, we hired companies like General Motors and McDonnell Douglas to build things for us to help us get there. Private actors have been getting us to space for a very long time, for the entire time that we have had space travel. That's the reality. And if NASA had tried to build everything in-house, I don't think we ever would have gotten to the moon.
Oh, I don't disagree with you there. That's absolutely true. There's always been this sort of public-private partnership. Of course, on the other side, some people might dislike that. You know, they might have wished that we had involved some sort of our own, I don't know, government-mandated manufacturing. Obviously, that's not where we usually come on. We usually don't come on that side of the argument. But
yeah,
no,
even from a
right.
liberty perspective. Even from a liberty perspective, oftentimes there can be real problems with public-private partnerships that public or private corporation can milk the government, or they can basically act corruptly, get a bunch of subsidies or whatever, and then skip town and leave the taxpayers holding the bag. Absolutely, public-private partnerships have to be done wisely. It's not as simple as these partnerships are always good or they're always bad. But in the case of the space race, or for that matter, World War II. We didn't have the military building all the new technology that we developed during World War II. We allowed the private sector, people in the private sector, to innovate, and that allowed us to win World War II. So it is a nuanced issue.
Yeah, the biggest difference here, I think, just to make it clear, is that, you know, in like using the analogy you just said of for instance, like the military buys its hardware and owns it. So the big difference, the big practical difference here is that NASA doesn't own the rocket. That's really the big difference. And that's what's sort of a game changer, because again, the space shuttle was owned by NASA, it was owned by the federal government. In this case, the Dragon vehicle that SpaceX is providing, it's essentially leased. This is in the article, they call this like, this is going to be like a space taxi. That's really not a good analogy. It's more like a space leasing company. You know what I mean? They're leasing the rocket to NASA, and they get to use it the way that they want.
Yeah. Well, good for them. I hope we get to Mars in our lifetime. Now, we had 2 more stories, and we had the Libertarian presidential nomination, Jo Jorgensen, you want to talk about, and we had the New Republic had some real hate for people who are just sick or experiencing their own quarantine fatigue. Which one did you want to hit first?
Let's go with yours. Looks like you got yours ready to go, right? So
yes. Yeah, so you can see the story, and it's called "The Deranged Civic Religion of the Lockdown Protesters." I thought this was a really interesting premise. I thought it could have been a really good article if it had been written by somebody who wasn't completely insane and so hateful. The 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 author of this article, let's bring her name. Libby Watson, I believe, was the byline. Yes, Libby Watson. And I tweeted something about her earlier this week. And if you go through the article, it's filled with all of this unnecessary invective. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of what's going on, people are afraid. And so their subconscious is taking over and they're allowing their imaginations to run wild, as we mentioned this with the masks, where people are so afraid of the masks that it's going to cut off your oxygen, or your antibodies are going to be activated, whatever the nonsense is that you're hearing from the Plandemic documentary. But here she's talking about people going to the mall, and she says it's a chilling description. The Washington Post published a chilling description of the first day of a reopened mall. How can this be chilling? Are you getting actual chills? It is so childish. But then it gets worse. The next line: bored rich people wandered the aisles, pawing at the wares. So she's dehumanizing them. First of all, they're rich people. They're not just people going to the mall. They're all, Thurston Howell the Third, which, so she's already jamming. Obviously, she has this agenda that she hates rich people or people she views to be rich. And I don't even know. I mean, do actual rich people go to the mall? Does Bill Gates go to the mall? Does Jeff Bezos actually go to the mall? Somehow, I don't think so. I don't think any real rich people were at the mall. But here's where it really goes off the rails. He says the right to visit whatever business you please is not one enshrined in the Constitution. And this gets to a fundamental misunderstanding of what rights are and what the Bill of Rights is. The Bill of Rights is not a comprehensive list of all of the rights that we have. The rights that we have are infinite and unenumerated. The government's powers are finite and enumerated. So you do, in fact, have the right to visit whatever business you please, and the onus is on the government to prove that you are endangering or infringing on the rights of others by patronizing that business. Okay?
But Pete, I want to mention something with that because this is the other side of it. I've said this from the beginning, that I feel like from the beginning we were going to have issues with chronic overreaction and chronic underreaction. Okay. And in this case, you kind of see this polarization that happens with our culture so often, and what happens with politics now. Everything becomes a true or false question. There's no multiple choice. There's no C. There's no none of the above, because sometimes everybody's wrong and doesn't understand this. And in this case, I think this is a great example of that. The issue is not, the issue of, okay, can I go to Arby's? Of course I can go to Arby's, but Arby's has every right to decide whether they want my business or not. And they can decide that I have to wear a mask in order to go to Arby's. They can decide that their employees have to wear masks in order to go to, work at Arby's. Arby's can make all of those determinations on their own and should be allowed to. I think what we see over here is there are these sort of viral videos, and I'm sure you've seen them, where you see these egregious examples of people just being complete jackasses. Okay, for instance, there's one that I saw where a guy is going to Costco and he says, I shouldn't have to wear a mask because Constitution, America, you know what I mean? And guess what? Costco is a club. You actually have to be a member to go in. If you are not a member, you cannot go in. And as a member, you have to abide by their rules. And if they decide that you have to wear a mask, they have every right to do that. And the idea that you are somehow entitled to go into a private business, literally as a club, literally as an exclusive club, because you have to have a membership to shop there, and then the idea that you have a right to be there any way you want, I made it analogous to the idea of, no shoes, no shirt, no service, that kind of a thing. That's kind of like an industry standard all over the country, all over the world. And it's like, if they decide that you have to wear shoes, you got to wear shoes. They decide you have to wear a shirt, you have to wear a shirt. They decide you want to wear a mask, you have to wear a mask. The issue, the dividing line, is when the government starts doing that. And that's where I think you get some of the, just the downright confusion and hatred, you know what I mean? And that kind of a thing, because we're not talking enough about sort of how this really works and how it's supposed to work. Instead, we're just saying, you know what? Everybody wear masks. You have to wear a mask, or nobody wear a mask because masks don't work. And there's no other debate. There's no other nuance other than those two positions. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, I agree. There's very little nuance. And here's, we've talked about already in this hour that people are taking this crisis and trying to jam their agenda. We're going to get rid of cash, or don't make me wear a mask, or whatever it is. They're trying to push their agenda instead of thinking about things rationally, about what needs to be done right now as a logical response to what's actually happening. So let me, I'm not going to read the whole article. You can go to the New Republic, or please don't. It's a terrible magazine. But I'm kidding. They have some good stuff from time to time. But this quotation really sums up what she's really upset about, which is conservatives, people who think differently than her. He says, but the people who took their AR-15s to Subway, citing their God-given freedoms as Americans, are not talking about their actual constitutional rights. They are talking about their unique understanding of the mythical promise of this nation, which is a place where a man can drive a big-ass truck, drink a 64-ounce Slurpee, and go to the air-conditioned mall to purchase stuff. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, you do not necessarily have a right to bring a rifle or an AR-15 into a Subway. If the Subway manager says, no, don't do that. I mean, if you have a concealed weapon, like a pistol or even a holstered pistol, that is far less aggressive than bringing an AR-15 into a business. But what really gets me is the next line, where she talks about America being a place where a man can drive a big-ass truck. You have a right to drive a big-ass truck. Okay, there's nothing wrong. You're not hurting anybody by driving a truck. I know it's putting emissions into the air, but to some degree, we accept that, right? We do have regulations. There are limits on car fleets and so on, but there's nowhere on the agenda where we're going to ban pickup trucks, and you would have riots if you did, and rightly so. Drink a 64-ounce Slurpee. Okay, as far as I know, there is no pollution. There is not even any kind of an externality that derives from drinking a 64-ounce Slurpee. You were maybe hurting yourself.
That shows a clear bias right there. That's part of that agenda of saying, okay,
yes.
So you can't have Slurpees. We're going to have city ordinances like in New York where they wanted to ban ban the big gulp. You know what I mean? Right. That stuff is just ridiculous. It's totalitarian. There's no objective reason for that other than to say, well, there's too many fat people and we want to make less fat people. That's not going to make less fat people. It's just not. You know what I mean? It's not going to even work for what their stated goal is. It's about control. It's about controlling people and controlling businesses.
And about controlling specific people. She is specifically bigoted against poor white people in the American South. Okay? The stereotype of the person drinking a Slurpee is somebody who's fat, probably white, probably poor. She hates certain people. And this is just oozing from this article. All of these stereotypes. And go to an air-conditioned mall to purchase stuff. You're not allowed to buy things? I mean, what is her point there? Except for she has no concept of what rights are or what freedom is. And so I think that there is a lot of these lockdown protesters have done crazy things. I think carrying automatic or semi-automatic weapons to these protests doesn't send a very good message, because the message isn't about, we're going to storm the Capitol building and murder legislators. Okay, that's the wrong message. If that's your message, don't send it. It's a bad message. But if your message is, hey, we have the right to peacefully go outside, assemble, we're not hurting anybody. Yes, we're taking a risk, but we have the right to determine what risks that we take. That's a sensible message. And so I think this article could have had promise, But as you said, it's so polarized. This whole COVID thing has become so polarized that people are sending insane messages of complete hatred and contempt for the other side of the aisle instead of thinking about what is right. They're so focused on winning and hurting the people who were not like them that they have lost all perspective of right and wrong.
Well, I think that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about because, again, what I was trying to say is everything in our society, it seems, has become a true or false test. That's it. It's like they're right or they're right, they're wrong or they're wrong. And of course, we know that's not true. Sometimes they're both wrong. Sometimes they're half right. There's all sorts of other possibilities when it comes to these kinds of issues. And of course, we do have other options. There are third parties in this country. I'm not sure if anybody knows that anymore because it was hard to even find an article about this. So for those that don't know, Jo Jorgensen has won the Libertarian Party presidential nomination. This was a little surprising to me. I'm not a big L libertarian, but I've been trying to follow the race as much as I can. I have shared several of the debates, both from the presidential candidates and the vice presidential candidates on the Twitter, the official Liberty Starship Twitter. And so the first thing I want to say is congratulations to Jo Jorgensen for winning the nomination. Good on you. I think the Libertarian Party can be very highly contentious. I think some interesting, strange things happened. I was surprised to see that the gray Larry Sharpe ticket kind of went down as quickly as it did because I thought that there was some more traction there than there obviously was. But it says that she won with slightly over 51% of the vote. That was on the fourth ballot with 524 votes. Jacob Hornberger actually came in second with nearly 28% of the vote. Then Vermin Supreme, which I think is your favorite, Peter. I think this is the person that you really wanted. He came in third with 20% of the final vote. I know you're a big fan of his. So
yes. So unfortunately, baby Hitler is safe for another 4 years. And I don't think we need to tolerate that. If you don't know, Vermin Supreme, and he's a joke candidate, he's a satirist who has promised to fully fund time travel. They always talk about how we're going to fully fund this, we're going to fully fund that, as though throwing money at a problem will necessarily solve it when maybe some problems aren't soluble. And so we're going to fully fund time travel, go back in time and kill baby Hitler, and then we'll avoid the Holocaust. So unfortunately, that kind of not even forward-thinking candidate, but backward-thinking candidate will not be the president.
Depends on your perspective there, right? I was actually surprised, I have to say, that Adam Kokesh and, again, also Judge James Gray did so poorly that they basically were knocked out, I think, in the first and second rounds. That really surprised me. And I don't know if you know a lot about them or if that surprised you, but that did surprise me. Apparently, they didn't have very much support.
Yeah, I did watch the Kentucky debate before we had Jacob Christian on the show because I wanted to see, okay, who's running and who are they and what do they think? And so I took pretty good notes. My impression of Judge Jim Gray was that he lacked charisma. Larry Sharpe, his VP, a lot of people have said maybe Larry Sharpe should have run for the nomination because he had a lot more charisma. Jo Jorgensen doesn't have a...
Well, I saw one of the vice presidential debates, and I caught the end of it. I didn't catch the whole thing. But I was looking in that chat. Oh, my goodness, there was some Larry Sharpe hate in there. And I was like, who are these people? Really, I was just sitting there like, who are these people that you don't acknowledge the fact? You don't have to, I understand if you don't agree with him on certain issues or whatever, but it's like, how far gone are these people that they think someone like Larry Sharpe is like a bad guy? And you know what I mean? Like I just saw some terrible comments in there and it really surprised me. And it's a big reason that it's a big reason that I will not join the Libertarian Party, because I just see such crazy positions sometimes. And I've made the point on this show many times that I think it's ironic, a group of people that say that they believe in voluntarism, they believe in the non-aggression principle, are so dismissive of people that don't agree with them on 100% of every issue. I just don't understand that. Now, the thing I like about Jorgensen that I saw was she says that she's much more pragmatic, that she believes basically in what people would term as the night watchman concept of government. She was very clear about that in terms of her political philosophy on the debate that I saw, where she said, I am absolutely pro-police, absolutely pro-military, absolutely pro-judge. I think those elements are important for a free society, and those are things that I will defend. And it's the rest of it that, of course, she questions. And my ideology fits more with that than probably any other presidential candidate in terms of, yes, that's kind of where I come from. Now, the practicality of how you start dismantling all these other things, that's a real question. And I don't know if she's prepared to answer that or not. I didn't see the whole debate. I haven't gotten a chance to look at her entire platform. But I always find that interesting because it's not like you can just turn the switch off the second you're elected. You can't just get rid of Social Security, for instance, on day one. There has to be a process. There has to be a plan. You can't just stop all the government cheese, just with a simple writing of the pen, right? As Obama used to say, have a pen. So you just use the pen and you wash it away. It doesn't really work like that. There's a lot of dependence on government right now. So you have to have some sort of a plan to get to where you want to go, where the government is about those things. It's about the most basic protections and all those kinds of things, as opposed to, of course, the other idea that's just straight up anarchy, which I don't advocate at all. So I don't know a whole lot about her. Do you know much about her, Pete?
Well, I just know what I saw during the debate, the Kentucky debate, and what she did run for vice president. I think back in 2000, she was Harry Brown's running mate, and Harry Brown
1996
was,
it's here at the
96?
Yeah, 96 Libertarian vice presidential candidate.
Okay, so she was one of Harry Brown's vice presidential nominees, running mates. He ran again in 2000, but I thought that she was very articulate. If anything, she comes across as though a little bit mousy. So although she's articulate, she won't scare a lot of voters. I don't know that she has a big idea that will bring them in. I think it's kind of, well, she's running on a third party ticket and I'm not afraid of her, but I don't really want her. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't see her getting a lot of traction. You did mention earlier, and I wanted to just mention him in passing, Adam Kokesh. I know exactly why Adam Kokesh didn't do better, because he has shown himself to be good at getting attention. He's had some legal issues, to be blunt, where he got arrested for having, I think it was mushrooms or something, psilocybin mushrooms in his house, and so he was basically daring people, the police, to arrest him. He got arrested at the Jefferson Memorial, and that I have a little more sympathy for. Okay, he was dancing at the Jefferson Memorial. Who are you really hurting there? Shouldn't you have a right to do it? It's kind of ironic. Jefferson is Mr. Liberty, and you're not allowing people to dance in front of his statue. That's crazy. Okay. But then when they wanted to bring guns into DC illegally, that was the thing where I said, okay, this guy is about himself and about self-promotion, and he doesn't have any common sense, because ultimately, between the gun charges and the drug charges, he went to jail and he viewed himself as a victim, but he was daring them to arrest him. And what was the point? What did he get out of that? Was there a mass movement that we need to, completely decriminalize get rid of every gun ordinance in DC, or we need to get rid of our psilocybin? No, he wasn't a martyr. He was just some guy who got himself arrested, and nobody outside of the Libertarian Party, practically, or the Liberty Movement more broadly, had ever heard of him.
Well, I just want to I want to get a little bit more basic than that on just some basic ideas here, because I did see a little bit of him on one of the debates. And he went after Gray, Judge. I understand jury nullification. I understand the idea, okay, and I understand the idea of advocating for it, okay. I understand, people that want to go out to the courts and they want to give literature so juries are aware of the concept of jury nullification, because I actually see jury nullification in a lot of ways as almost a free speech issue, and I think it could be argued that way, but I don't hear it articulated that way very often. But it's a controversial issue, but it's one of those issues almost nobody cares about. And if you're going to hang somebody on the issue of jury nullification and their position on jury nullification, I'm sorry, but 99% of the people out there, especially the people that vote, could care less about jury nullification and don't know what it is. I do know what jury nullification is, and I like I said, I believe that it could be advocated more from a First Amendment point of view. But at the same time, I'm like, I know this is not a winning issue. I know that this is not something that I could base a campaign on. And it's certainly not something that I would hang another candidate on, because this man's a judge and he's not for jury nullification enough. I just found that bizarre. That's just my personal opinion of what little I saw during the debate, because he specifically went after Gray about that. And I just was like, this is your big issue? Jury nullification? Nobody cares about this.
I'm a big fan of jury nullification. I think we can talk about it on a later show. But I agree.
But nobody else cares about it, Pete. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not saying no to jury nullification. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And again, I think that it should be advocated more, even as a First Amendment thing. But if you run on that, I'm sorry, Pete. Nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to care.
Sure. Well, it's an issue that I think you're right. If you're going to make it an issue, libertarians have done a good job of bringing a lot of issues to the public, from drug legalization, getting rid of the public school monopoly. We now have charter schools and
by the way, Gray's
because of libertarians.
But Gray's big issue was the drug war. You know what I mean? That's what his cornerstone issue is that he's built a reputation as someone that's been against the drug war as a judge. And so he has an incredible amount of credibility in my mind. This is the kind of person that you want to put to the public. I don't know, just the whole hanging him on jury nullification, I thought was just
sure. Stupid. So a couple things. First of all, you're right. If you're going to run on it, a lot of groundwork has to be laid to get the public on board with this. You can't just say, jury nullification, expect people to know what you're talking about. Right now, nobody knows what that is. It's not a winning issue. The reason why these other issues are winning issues is because we've spent decades, at least 50 years, advocating for this and educating people. It doesn't happen overnight. And you don't have the luxury as a third party, especially a party that builds itself as the party of principle, to say we're going to kick people out of our tent and still expect that you're going to get, whatever the threshold is, 2, 3, 5, or 15%, if that's the goal. You're not going to do that by pushing issues that nobody cares about and saying anybody who doesn't believe in this right now is my enemy. You have to convince people this is a republic. It's not a dictatorship where Adam Kokesh is going to become president, even if he did, and then the next day make jury nullification the law of the land the next day. It will not happen. It's a ridiculous idea.
Yeah, I just thought it was a strange thing to go after him about, especially a person who was an actual judge and all that. I just thought it was silly. So
yeah, and I think it gets to the point that Adam Kokesh isn't a serious person. I think Judge Jim Gray's biggest problem is that he completely lacks charisma. I don't think that Jo Jorgensen is the most zippy candidate, but she was more articulate and I thought more charismatic than Judge Jim Gray was. He was almost falling asleep during the debate. Just my opinion.
I wouldn't go that far personally, but
he's not Joe Biden, but he was kind of a boring candidate. Let's face it.
I will say Jorgensen philosophically comes closest to what I believe philosophically. I just think that I wonder how much of a plan she has to actually implement that, because you can't just do that overnight. We've got a lot. And you have to determine what the low-hanging fruit is. For instance, on the conservative side, usually they'll go after something like the Department of Education or something like that. If you can eliminate one department, that would be a pretty big accomplishment. You know what I mean? That's moving in the right direction. And so far, nobody's been able to do that. So maybe start there or something like that, and eventually we'll get to where our government should be.
Yeah, DHS. Just roll it back into the military defense.
Yeah, that would not be a winning issue right now, Pete. That would not be a good campaign.
That was it.
Cornerstone of your campaign. That's what I'm talking about. The pragmatism. So and often you just don't see the pragmatism that you need in order to be electable. So
and almost every department, including DHS, obviously that was a joke, they do things that are needed. You can't just get rid of all the offices inside of DHS. What would happen if you did get rid of one of these departments is you'd have to move some of their functions to a different department, which is kind of a bit
I have a great one.
Mhm.
I have a great one. And actually, my conservative friend said this to me when this first happened, back when there was all the political will in the world to make this happen. When Homeland Security was created, there was a whirlwind of bipartisan support that this was a great reform, this was a great move. And I remember one of my friends, who I think of as he has a lot of libertarian tendencies, but he's by and large sort of more of a classic conservative type of person. And he's a complicated person. He doesn't believe all liberty. He's pragmatic. He's a very pragmatic individual. But one of the things he said that I love, and I never heard anybody else say this, is we already have a Department of the Interior. Why do we have to create another department to consolidate all these different agencies? Why couldn't we just put them in there? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
Why do we have to create an entire new executive department? That's one of that to me is like low-hanging fruit. But I've never heard anybody else say that other than my friend, that was just observing that and saying, we already have a Department of the Interior. We have existing departments that we could scale up and handle this if that's what we want to do. Of course, the question also becomes: was consolidating them really the right thing to do? That's a totally different conversation. But at the very least, we could say.
Right.
But I'm just saying, at the very least, you could say we don't need to create an entire new executive department, an entire new bureaucracy. We could simply expand an existing one.
Sure, but at that point, you're really talking about reorganization, not actually getting rid of the thing. You're just moving the dirt under the rug. But
but the dirt was already there.
I think we can leave it at.
Well, but I just want to make that point. The dirt was already there. These agencies already existed. What all the Homeland Security did was consolidate a bunch of different agencies that are, quote unquote, related to security under one executive branch. Because, for instance, before, the Coast Guard used to be part of the Department of Transportation, and then it was moved to Homeland Security. You had a bunch of other departments that were shuffled around from where they used to be. If you wanted to shuffle them all around, you could have just taken an existing department and shuffled them all under them instead of creating an entire new department. That's the point I want to make sure.
Yeah, I hear you. All right, well, I think we're gonna have to leave it there tonight. There's a lot more we could talk about. We have a couple of stories we didn't even have time. Andy Biggs and drones. Oh, by the way, Andy Biggs doesn't want the federal government to spy on you with drones. So now we covered that story. So we did what we promised in our tweet earlier, which is good. You shouldn't spy on you with drones. But I think that we're gonna have to leave it there for tonight because we're already at an hour and a half, which is a lot longer than we normally do. But until next week, my name is Pete Maines. I'm here with Eric Alexander. Till next week, you keep flying free.